Good evening. You're watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I am with Dave Frank, and we're going to discuss national news of the day. And for the first topic, we've got several items of news that are basically revolving around the Federal Reserve. One is the failure of the Silicon Valley Bank and at least one other bank in New York. I'm forgetting what it was called, but then there's a third one.
Signature Bank.
Signature. That's right. And Moody's has actually lowered the ratings of 6 other banks. And so, this is an issue that the Federal Reserve has to address. And also, Yellen was being grilled by the Finance Committee, by Elizabeth Warren, asking, what are you going to do to protect the depositors? Yellen was saying, well, we're going to have a meeting with them. But apparently a lot of pressure got put onto them. And no, they basically the Biden administration has taken over the bank and fired everybody, replacing everybody, probably going to change the name from what I understand. So we have that going on. But we also have inflation. It's starting to taper off. I think the core was at under 6%, but unfortunately, food and fuel are still up there right now. Gas is starting to move up again, and food just won't relent for whatever reason. So Powell is very much obsessed with that and got into an argument either last week or the week before with Elizabeth Warren, who says, you're deliberately trying to get 2 million people fired or laid off, that's 2 million families that are going to suffer. And Powell saying, well, everybody's suffering under inflation, and it was a real interesting exchange. But Warren trying to say it's not the only way to fight inflation. There have been a lot of other things that we could try, and in the meantime, there's a question as to whether or not pushing up these interest rates are possibly putting the banking industry into jeopardy. So, do they go back to pushing it by, half or 3/4 of a point, or will they just do 0.25? I think the meeting comes up either this week or next week, and they've got to make a decision there. But, the inflation isn't the only concern. It's not the only thing that the Fed is there for. They've got to worry about the health of the economy as a whole. There's a lot more to the Silicon Valley and Signature Bank failures than the interest rate. But due to the specific nature of those particular banks, apparently the interest rate is of a particular interest to them. It puts them in difficulty. A lot of debates over what happened in 2018 when a number of Democrats joined the Republicans to reverse some banking regulation. Of course, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and the rest are saying, see, I told you so. But even the Democrats who voted for that are not being very apologetic. A lot to discuss here. What is the Fed going to do? Where are we at with the economy? And is a recession going to happen? Dave.
Yeah. So these are big questions you just asked. So I'm gonna start small and then go big. We can go big at the end, maybe. I know a lot of people are kind of sick of hearing about this story already, even though it's been like less than a week, just because it's been so front and center in media sources. But I think it's really critical because there are so many different elements of this that it gets a little confusing. I think the best place to start is that, like you said, in the current environment, with inflation being such a problem for the global economy, for the domestic economy, the main tool rather in the Fed's toolbox is to continue to raise rates. And they've slowed down those the pace at which they're raising them, but they are forecast to raise another 1/4 point per month for the next 3 months and then beyond, depending on what happens. So they're going to continue to put downward pressure on prices that will put upward pressure on unemployment. And it's going to, there's going to be pain, which the question is there going to be a soft landing or not, recession or not?
Let me go before you move on from that topic. The Fed has been upping the rates now for close to a year.
Yeah.
It hasn't tamed inflation. Yeah, so yeah, they say that and this is me showing a little bit of my bias here, but they say when you just keep doing the same thing over and over again with the same non-results, it's an indication of insanity. But it's not having an effect. Obviously, there needs to be something else done, something more holistic than the rest. I mean, it hasn't even led to the unemployment, right? I mean, so whatever's happening, people are willing to pay the prices or whatever, and nobody's pulling the jobs out. Maybe it's time to think of something else. I mean, it's a year later
Yeah.
and we're still a little bit lower in inflation, but I think due to forces that probably have nothing to do with the interest rates.
Yeah, and it's true that a more holistic approach to dealing with inflation is definitely that something that people ought to consider in big picture. And I agree with you there. But I'll say I think it's what's interesting here is why that this bank closed at this time. And so one of the key elements here is that it's a special bank. People have talked about it had it's whatever the 16th or so largest bank in the country because Silicon Valley folks have so much money that they were able to get at near zero interest. And they've gotten these huge stock. Many of them have gotten huge stock options based on being incubators of tech companies, et cetera. So they really did have, I think the number was about 120 or so $billion, something like that. But the idea was that they have regulations about how much reserve capital to have. It's kind of technical, but the idea is that one of the safest things they could have done was to keep buying long-term government debt, U.S. government debt. So that's what they did. They took a pretty conservative approach there. People are criticizing how they didn't use advanced like hedging, not so advanced, but technical hedging strategies in case rates kept going up because everybody knew they were going up. So there's a mismanagement component there, of course. But just from a technical side, just because it makes sense, I think it's really easy to explain to people that they needed to have a certain amount in reserves, but as interest rates go up, the value of the long-term bonds go down. So the face value might be like $1,000, but as interest rates go from 0 to 5, it goes from $1,000 to like 900 or 880, and that's about where they were. And that's just a rough estimate. People were saying that it was down about 12% on face value, something to that effect. So that in effect, the bank really only had about 88% of the money that they had on their books was immediately available for cash. So what they started to do was they made an announcement, hey, we're going to sell some more debt. So that we can raise a little bit of $2.5 billion in capital, so that we just have the money that we need to stay legal and resilient. But once the word got out that they were selling, this was an issue. There was a run that was caused. We'll talk about the run in a second, but I think sticking to this is really important because what you've heard from the government, obviously this is a national politics show. What you've heard from the government is that this is containable because the underlying assets are going to be worth their value. It's just that they are temporarily, when they come to maturity over the long term, but as they, temporarily they don't have that same value, right? And so the government's saying nothing to see here. We will just create this, the Fed, basically, the FDIC in conjunction with the Fed, we're going to create a special lending mechanism where all the money that the bank says it really has, and we'll lend them the money that they need temporarily if an issue like this comes up. If they're not managing their bank exactly appropriately, if they're growing a little too fast, or they're not doing this hedging strategy, then we'll lend them basically any money that they need to make it happen, and the taxpayers won't have to pay for anything. There's a lot in there, but the short version is that means that moral hazard is out the window, and that the Federal Reserve and the FDIC has said you can run your banks, within reason. If you have a bank under what's called a systemically important bank, which we'll talk about that. But the idea is that these regional mid-sized banks have a competitive advantage because they're not as regulated due to the lobbying efforts of both Republicans and Democrats going along and their former members of Congress who are lobbying their colleagues and saying, oh, these medium banks, they don't need the scrutiny. They're not the reason that 2008 happened. And so the deregulation really was part of the proximate cause. The fact that these banks didn't have to do stress tests is why this happened. And the contagion problem is that all the regional banks have this same type of problem where they're not regulated quite enough like the big banks because of Congress lobbying Congress to take multi-million-dollar payouts. So there's an element of this which really the Elizabeth Warrens of the world really are correct, I would say. And one last thing, what caused that actual run? And we're going to see the FBI is investigating that the tech sector itself might have been a little too clever by half. And Peter Thiel, who's famously a funder of Republican candidates for Senate, like, for example, in Arizona and Ohio in the last election, not that long ago, this guy, he sent a message out to 200 of his friends in Silicon Valley, 200 colleagues, and said, hey, by the way, did you see what they just did? Maybe this bank's So
Yeah.
there's evidence of that happening, but also he didn't just do it to 200 friends. He did it also in another medium also. So the FBI is going to get involved and say, did you guys intentionally cause this drama? And the truth is, it's a yes or no. They'll see in these messages, hopefully, that did they intentionally just collapse this bank in effect for sport, with the consequence of now all these medium-sized banks were in jeopardy.
All right. Yeah, I need to just a personal note. I knew Peter Thiel as a kid. This other kid and I were middle school level chess champions of San Mateo County, and then all of a sudden this whiz kid sixth grader comes in and just kicked our butts and became champion. He is brilliant, reactionary and strange, but brilliant. But anyway, I wanted to also point out that there's a really unintended consequence of if indeed this bank failure was even partly related to the increase in the rates, the interest rates. It actually, by causing this bank failure or having be an impartial factor in it, it's caused the 10-year Treasury bill to go down because supply and demand. Nobody wants to buy those right now, right? They don't feel safe. So that has fallen, which has actually led to mortgage rates falling. And they're talking about a possible revival of the housing market, which is completely stimulative. So this might actually totally counteract anything they're trying to do with inflation. When you try to do it playing around with money, you can have side effects that everybody, that we can't even anticipate. I mean, the Hayek's and von Mises of the world are right about that. There can be unintended consequences of messing with the economy, whether it's a socialist intervention or a monetarist intervention. So the question is what do they do? And the things that the Elizabeth Warrens of the world have and other lefties have been trying to do, and I admit my biases behind that, is they say that the whole point of inflation is to pull money out of the service and goods economy so that they're not spending so much. So give them incentive to spend on something else. Well, one thing that's been proposed is to give a tax credit for a temporary amount of time for paying off debt, credit card debt, mortgage, whatever. And then the money would go into that, and it wouldn't be spent on goods, and it could actually help with inflation. But that would obviously cut into profit margins of credit card companies and the rest. So if you want to be my vulgar, Marxism, latent Marxism coming in, that's the reason it's not going to happen. They'd much rather just lay off 2 million workers. So this is a big discussion, and unfortunately, I don't know. I mean, everybody's like saying, "Oh, Elizabeth Warren should have been the vice president." If she was the vice president, she wouldn't be in the finance committee terrorizing these, people who have to answer for it, including Yellen, by the way. So, I mean, there's a lot to say about this. There's a lot of technical stuff to talk about, and it's really complicated. And the point of economics is we really don't know what's going to happen when people do certain things. But since inflation got tamed under Reagan, when he was spending like crazy through monetarist policy, then the Fed seems to think of that as its primary job, to keep inflation in town. That's not what it was created to do, by the way. And by upping interest rates and forcing unemployment. But it hasn't worked, as we've talked about. I mean, we can't really do the subject justice, so I'm going to let you have the last minute and a half here.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is really most interesting about this, too, is that the fact that they're going to continue raising rates. So it's a known entity here that they're going to inflict the pain. The question is, at what pace? The idea being that there's this I don't want to say magic. There's the invisible hand of the market. But so that goes back. We say, oh, that's Adam Smith, right? But interestingly, Adam Smith also said that the people that are in control of the markets are who you need to pay the most attention to, because they have such amazing power and conviction and they have this capacity to coordinate, to cause real impact. So pay very close attention. But it turns out their eyes glaze over and not a lot of attention ends up getting paid. People just say, oh, well, I'm just glad there's somebody there to make sure the money's in the bank when I go to the bank, But the truth is that they have, created extraordinary mechanisms for what amounts to privatizing profit and socializing risk. So if people can keep that in mind, that inflation is caused by business owners raising prices, and the system that we have in place right now ignores that piece of it. I'm not advocating anything in particular, other than that people get a little bit better informed about the mechanisms at play.
Real quickly, the Adam Smith, fun fact, actually advocated welfare programs. He didn't call it welfare programs at the time, but he did believe in government safety net intervention. Everybody always cites him like he's, again, von Mises. He wasn't. But we need to move on. We will probably be talking about this again. Okay, the presidential politics are heating up, particularly within the Republican primaries as they're shaping up. We've got more candidates and possible candidates in the wings, but everybody is looking to Trump and DeSantis. DeSantis has a good economic thing going for him in Florida, a lot of controversy in the culture war, as we have discussed and will discuss, and book burning and all kinds of stuff. And he's going after the hotel that did the drag show some months ago. He wants to take their license away. Going after Disney seems to be good at that, but he's being seen as an amateur when it comes to foreign policy, and he showed it yesterday when he basically called Ukraine a territorial dispute, and as if one country didn't invade the other country. It's just, and he is advocating against what he calls, and a lot of Republicans who are of that bent are calling the blank check policy of the war, that we need to rein it in, and the rest, and basically there's been a revival of conservative isolationism, the type that we saw in the late 30s that led to Neville Chamberlain. Conservatives have always, Cold War conservatives have always liked to rag on him as this kind of liberal. He wasn't. He was a Tory, and he was primarily instructive of the leaders too in selling out Germany. Selling, and as well as Austria. So anyways, we've got this position, and as soon as he said that, Beltway Republicans slammed him. Everybody, including Mitch McConnell, Rubio in his own state, are slamming him, saying, no, we need to support Ukraine because, of very interesting politics. But the Republicans have a very kind of isolationist, almost pro-Putin aspect to them within the MAGA situation, because like Trump, they respect kind of the machismo in politics and what Putin has done, so it's leading to very interesting dynamics. I don't think Trump is really attacking on it so much because it's kind of his position as well. But they're certainly attacking each other on all kinds of other stuff. But very interesting is that DeSantis knows he has to make a play for MAGA, and apparently this is first time he speaks up seriously on a foreign policy issue. This is what he says.
Yeah, really interesting dynamic at play, and we've talked about this in the past too, where it's still early in the cycle. We're talking about the 2024 election, and it's still just March. But that said, this is what's happening. There's a claim being made here from DeSantis that even though he hasn't announced he's running yet, that he's the preferred candidate to be the national leader. So he's dipping his toe in the water of speaking about foreign policy. But unfortunately, he doesn't have a strong grasp of what's happening. Or if he does, he's a very intelligent guy. If he does, he's preferring the horse race aspect of this. So he's really tied his agenda currently as his strategy, I guess you could call it, to, like you said, courting Trump voters. So Trump himself has even said, like, look, DeSantis is just me, but he's copying me in my positions. I think David Frum wrote an article in the Atlantic recently that really kind of captures how this may be a losing strategy, because while this is what it will probably take for DeSantis to get, we'll call it the Fox News viewing audience, the approximately third of the Republican Party on board, away to pry away from Trump if something were to happen, like I don't know, if something were to happen, we'll leave it at that. The idea, though, is that the further towards MAGA he goes, he not only alienates, Democrats and moderates, but he's also alienating the former Republican establishment types too. So yeah, there's a group of those folks who have already peeled off, and the Lincoln Project types that really did rally around Biden. These are Republicans that have sort of peeled off against Trump. But what DeSantis is really doing is he's, to an extent, I think the way David Frum framed it was, step one, preach to the Fox MAGA crowd. Step two, I don't know how I'm going to do this. Step three, lose the general election. So he hasn't thought about step two. They're not at step two. So he's really just doing the step one thing. He's increasing his exposure, and trying to, again, not to beat a dead horse here, but what he's really doing is Tucker Carlson. What sort of, I think, got this motivation for DeSantis to put the word out about his opinion this past week was that Tucker Carlson said, we've asked all of the people who even potentially are going to be Republican candidates for the presidency, where do you stand on this? And he asked a few questions. I heard him say it on air recently. And he said he hadn't heard back from anybody. But now DeSantis team, Brain Trust, got together and basically said, it's what we think Trump voters and Fox viewers want to hear is, and it's how you started this off, that it's a territorial dispute that's not a U.S. core national interest, but that goes against an awful lot of the current discourse.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and it is really heating up. It's kind of interesting because Trump didn't join the bandwagon on that. He's attacking him most recently on ethanol. which is, a kind of for whatever reason, I haven't read up on it, but for whatever reason, this country's right wing doesn't like ethanol, and that which is kind of interesting too, because Trump doesn't usually focus on policy wonkish type stuff, but he's obviously sees DeSantis as the threat, and he's obviously serious about winning. I had thought for the longest time that Trump was doing this to raise money, but he is seriously attacking DeSantis, and it's starting to be in ways that can actually hurt DeSantis, and with winning the general election. And the problem is DeSantis could probably have done better and not received the rebuke from senators and Beltway Republicans if he'd worded it differently. It's part of his inexperience as if he just stuck to, well, we can't do a blind check. We ought to have audits. We ought to know where the money's going. We ought to make sure it's not going to Azov. If he'd done that, but he doesn't have, he's not that smart in that way. He's a political animal. He knows how to do things. He knows how to frame things in kind of a Trumpian low-key way, and have his enemies and his positions that he defends and makes hay with. Sometimes the stupid way the left attacks him, just as Trump benefited from it. You got to be really careful on that. But foreign policy it's looking like so far it's his weak point, and the term territorial dispute was a mistake. That's going to come back to haunt him for a long time.
But you would guess, I mean, it's an informed guess, an educated guess, but you would guess that this is what his team has decided was the approach. This is what people wanted to hear. And so two things here. One is, I didn't mention this earlier, but if you look at the footage of DeSantis from when he was in Congress, Crimea was invaded, 9 years ago. He was in Congress back then, around 2017, I think. He's on the record of saying that the United States needs to stand with Ukraine. So DeSantis himself has changed his tune, recalibrated, instead of sticking with whoever it is in Congress who may have been speaking with him about the importance. You could speculate that it's, defense contractors, funders, any of the various experts that come calling in the halls of Congress to lobby on their position. You'd think that there was just a lot more people saying, oh, yeah, defend Ukraine. Whereas now he's got a different calculus, and that calculus is about pandering to a known entity, which is, again, I hate to say this again, but it's really the Tucker Carlson script. I think, like you said, I agree with you that that's a mistake. But just another example of that, of how this is kind of playing out, is that typically, the Republicans, at least as long as, most of my life, they've been, the Chamber of Commerce types, the business community types, the more conservative, fiscally, certainly. And so they've supported business, deregulation, but not just deregulation, also, funding special projects and sort of the government intervening to cultivate, to a certain extent, some industrial development. But this MAGA backlash against the swamp, one flavor of that, like the ethanol, like you said, you could pretty clearly imagine that Trump's folks, besides the fact that they're supported by the energy industry, they also could argue that we just don't want extra money going to grow a food crop in the name of a fuel crop. That just doesn't seem to equate. Biofuel in general, I think, is kind of a wasteful way to use a potential food source, the people believe. But so if you are then saying, well, I want to support that sector, I want to support the folks that believe in ethanol, that a lot of farmers like the known the known crops that go into the sweeteners and the fuels, so we can easily get rid of this corn. I don't know if people know this, but most of the corn that's grown is not like the really great white sweet corn that we get from the grocery store.
It's for feed and fuel.
Exactly that,
animal
right?
feed and fuel, yeah.
Exactly. So that constituency, and it just goes to show a little bit of a split between the two. So maybe we're going to see this play out, that there are some areas of differentiation between the two of them.
Well, and Florida is one of the big producers of ethanol. So that is one of the reasons DeSantis needs to champion it. It's a feather in his cap that it's doing as well, even though it doesn't. I mean, it's nowhere near as much as Iowa, but for instance, but it does have a it is part of the industry. And it's DeSantis probably just thinks that he's supporting, again, it's not a fossil fuel, but hey, it's still a combustion fuel, right? So it's
and farmers and the chemical industry and the biotech industry, the Monsantos of the world that make the special seeds and the special, all that. So there's a constituency there. There's a potential fundraising source, unfortunately. I mean, that's the calculus.
Yeah, the reason corn is so big and powerful for all those, it goes back to Nixon. Nixon was the first one who set up subsidies for him to actually subsidize, to develop all of this. You had the energy crisis, so that's when it came up, the biofuel as an alternative. So it's very complicated. I'm not, I also think it's being put forth as a panacea, and I'm critical of it. There's a lot, but that's a complicated discussion, and just a debate between Trump and DeSantis is not going to be very nuanced. We know that.
Yeah, and I would add too. I think we're going to hit on this in the next segment too. But DeSantis's claim to fame, as far as his national exposure, the way that he pivoted from his leadership as a governor in Florida over COVID response and the freedom elements of that, he pivoted to sort of the anti-critical race theory, I'm just going to say it, even though who even knows what it means, but the anti-wokeness factor. It seems that the phrase is pervading any policy topic. We could even look back to our last segment with the bank. You saw, not maybe you, but people saw that Fox News had a bunch of people out there talking about how that bank that failed, Silicon Valley Bank, that maybe you should look at the equity and diversity policies of their board somehow affecting their their success, which is and I have to give credit to I forgot her name right now on MSNBC, Alex somebody, I forgot her last name, but she said she had an expert on hedge funds on the show recently and said, do these two lanes overlap at all? Is like diversity in a board and a bank's policies, do they overlap at all here? Is that even a thing? And the expert was like, no, these are capitalists doing what capitalists do. They're trying to maximize the profit of the bank, and the fact that people are out there trying to make hay with culture war issues it's opportunism, and it's inaccurate, and this is my word, not theirs, but it's sort of exploiting your listening audience.
Yeah, I mean, I will be covering, because I do believe that DeSantis will eventually declare. He's spending time in Iowa. That's also probably why he's talking about ethanol, but and the like. But it's it's definitely on, and we know it's going to be between those two. Will somebody be able to slip in and maybe pull ahead of them by holding on to the more traditionally conservative vote, that supports Beltway? I don't know how many voters that is, but can Nikki Haley slip in and benefit from the fight between the two MAGA candidates? I don't know. I don't. Pence is talking about running. I mean, we've got a bunch of people that are doing that, but it's at any rate. But again, Ukraine. I mean, they definitely have to be scared about what's going to happen in 2024 if the war isn't over by then. And right now, there's no negotiations happening. They're fighting, over territory, World War I style, which we always thought was kind of over. It's at any rate, this discussion is going to be interesting, because there will be a push to at least rein in some of the spending. And I'm online talking with MAGA, supporters who think that we've already given the country, Ukraine, F-16s. Now, it's not even going to happen, right? But anyway, we do need to move on. And we've got a third topic coming up.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, William Jefferson Clinton, do solemnly swear.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear. So help me God.
Okay, what is drag? We've been talking on this show about the war on drag by the Republicans. It's all over. We've seen it locally. It's actually been kind of vicious locally. We've seen it nationally. We are seeing anti-drag bills being passed in Tennessee. There's going to be one that is being proposed in Texas that'll be another bounty hunter type law where you turn in drag in front of kids and you can actually be financially rewarded for it. The bill that passed in Tennessee restricts adult cabaret performances in public or in the presence of the children. We're also seeing a lot of anti-trans legislation happening, defense of the children. We don't have the right to allow them to do this, even if that's what they want to do. And we've got 9 Republican-led state legislatures pushing similar anti-drag bills as the one in Tennessee. It's on, but they're having a hard time, Republicans, and when they're drawing these things up, as to the constitutionality of it. And one of it is you need bright lines in order for something to be constitutional. How do you define drag? It's will this prohibit showing Some Like It Hot or Tootsie or Mrs. Doubtfire to children? It's what they have a definition in a law that's probably never going to see light of day in Arizona because I don't think they have the votes to pass it. But the bill introduced there defines it as a performer who dresses in clothing and in makeup opposite of their gender at birth to exaggerate gender signifiers and roles and engage in singing, dancing, or a monologue or skit. I mean, there's a lot in there. How do you define clothes that are opposite the gender at birth? You got to have some way of defining that. I mean, do you say skirt? Well, how do you define a skirt? Does that mean Scottish kilts? So we've got a lot. They've got a lot of real issues here, and they're trying to deal with Shakespearean comedies. And how do you define a performance? You got those 4 definitions there. So if somebody in drag goes and just reads a book in a school library, that's been some of the things that they do. Is that constituting a performance? Or a ballet? That's not on the list there, right? There's all kinds of things that can be done here because they are passing laws that when laws are this insane, there's no way to legally define them, and it's going to be crazy. I want to give you an example of a way it was in work. I spent some time living in Washington State up north, just outside Bellingham, which is near the Canadian border. And there's this town called Linden that boasts, at least back in the 80s, I don't know if it's still true, the most churches per capita on the West Coast of any municipality. It's very conservative, Dutch reform there. I mean, the joke up there among activists was that the reason the Netherlands is so liberal is all the reactionaries moved to South Africa and Linden. So it's they passed a law that prohibited dancing in the 2 institutions in the town that sold alcohol, and so people drove all the way up from Seattle and all the way down to Vancouver to test the definition of dancing. If you're tapping your leg too much, the feet had to be touching the ground. So if you're touching the ground, even if you're sitting in a stool, can you dance on a table then? You're not touching the ground. I mean, when you start doing this, it gets ridiculous until finally the constable of that town, that's what they call him, the constable, said, I'm not enforcing this ordinance. Fire me and get somebody else. I'm not enforcing it. So they're looking for a mess. It's going to be very interesting as people test what is the definition of drag, and they're going to do this because it's so abominable that they're even doing this. That first of all, the presumption is that drag is a sexual expression of a sex in terms of prurient interest inherently, and they don't get it. It isn't even that. It could be, but it's not that all the time. And so we've got these laws that are going to pass. There's going to be huge court fights over it, and it'll have to be like Justice Black when he was talking about pornography, when they're trying to come up with a definition of pornography. I'll know it when I see it rule, but Justice Black isn't around to tell us what's pornography anymore. So it's anyway, they're in a quandary here. The Republicans, they're trying to come up with a legal definition of drag, but they're having a hard time coming up with a legal definition of performance.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for setting this up with so much background and nuance. I appreciate everything that you've said so far. I start from the position of we have a mass delusion here, and the mass delusion is the equation of people that are somehow culturally insensitive enough not to practice their own libertarian live and let live, keep your laws off my life sentiments. Many of the conservatives and Republicans out there really do believe that you shouldn't have laws for most things that you don't need to, but because of how energized this mass delusion has gotten a small subset of people, it's kind of almost taken on a momentum of its own. And really a couple angles I want to mention. One is, like you said, the art aspect. So one piece of this, when I think of drag, and from my experience, there's an artistic performance element of it. So what you're saying is that we don't want children to be exposed to this type of art, and if that's not particularly reasonable, but it's at least, if they made that case, then you would at least you would know that they kind of understand what they're even talking about. They'd be wrong, of course, because Greek theater, it's not just, you said Shakespeare, but it's all the way, like the earliest Greek drama was a bunch of men dressed up as men and women.
Women weren't allowed to be actresses.
Yes, exactly. So it's art itself has always performance art has always been entertaining to the cultured and non-cultured alike. Everybody accepted it. I mean, all the way to the very recent past, that this is something that people have appreciated and respected as an art form. But secondarily from that, and I think more tragically and more potentially harmful to people in communities across the country, is to then equate and project that on the criminalization of non-binary gender. So if you have this traditional perspective that it's what is a woman? I saw Marsha Blackburn saying, "What is a woman?" in Congress in a way that every time she said it, you just thought, this is performative, I hope, because otherwise it's the most baseness of ignorance possible in our Congress. But she's not alone. And so the harm factor is, if you're criminalizing people for the clothes they wear and their hair and the way that they just live their life, it causes no harm to anybody for people to be expressing themselves. That's dangerous. And so the fact that people are talking about passing laws down this path, I hope that we reach a point where we're able to snap these people out of their beliefs that are just so misguided and inaccurate about the theoretical potential actual harms that are virtually non-existent. I once reported to a gentleman who was a captain in the Army, and we worked at a large pharmaceutical company, and we were talking about a particular problem that existed in the city we lived in. And he said, "You know what? That problem exists in the Army, because the Army is a snapshot of society. That problem exists in the company, because the company is a snapshot of the society. every problem that we have is represented in every community, but projecting those problems onto people just because they were in the army or just because they work for a pharmaceutical company, that's completely, it's not even possible. It's so wrong. And so that leads me to one last point I'll make before I hand it over to you here, is that we honestly have reached a point where it's, for example, the Tennessee case, the lieutenant governor of Tennessee, who has gone on the record of being, very conservative and in alignment with the law, like this type of, legislation of hate and ignorance. He was caught on one of the social media platforms, leaving like flames and hearts for a young gay man.
Yes.
Yeah. And he was interviewed about it, and he basically was like, yeah, I like it. And there was no contradiction, but more importantly, no backlash. So his own people are like, well, he's one of us. He voted for these laws. He supports these laws. He's one of us. But then he's like, no, I can like scantily clad, young men. That's fine. And his comments on there were kind of like, they were sexual in nature. So it's like, oh, I like sexual in nature, ... And so, but the fact that there's no contradiction within his own mind or in the minds of his colleagues and peers in Tennessee, I think it's indicative of the magnitude of the challenge that we have to kind of crack this, again, bubble of ignorance.
I mean, and also this whole thing about kids being so fragile that if they're exposed to something like that, they're going to be hurt. I mean, if they're really worried about kids being exposed to sexual, blatantly sexual material, the internet, even with these supposed child protection apps, it's easy to access pornography, and they do it because they're curious, right? Especially when it's forbidden fruit. And I hear Republicans saying that kids shouldn't even be thinking of sex until they're 10 years old, and whereas my parents, their philosophy was they're old enough to know about sex when they ask about it, and I asked about it when I was 4. That's when I learned how babies were made, and and it was just like, and I had this situation because there was some confusion and they didn't want to get into details, where I said, okay, but how do you make the sperm come out as opposed to the urine? And my mother said, well, you'll know how to do it when then, and I got mad at her and said, well, it'll be your fault if I end up peeing in somebody. I mean, so there's a lot of room for confusion around it, but so what? There's confusion. You can explain it. The fact that there are men and women who dress up in clothes of the gender opposite to their birth or whatever, it's not something that's all that new, but for some reason it's caught on as something that they want to attack, but only in specific contexts, but they're not quite sure of what those contexts are. They just know that there are these drag shows happening where kids are being wounded by exposure to the wrong kind of sexuality, and it lacks specification. I mean, when I'm asked what is a woman by right-wingers online, I say, okay, do you mean biologically? Do you mean socially? Do you mean psychologically? Or do you mean legally? And they're like, what? No. What is a woman? And it's like, well, it depends on the context. What you're talking about? There's legal definitions, there's biological definitions, there's psychological definitions, and there's social definitions. They don't want the nuance is just not something they want to deal with. But when it comes to a matter of law and lawsuits, and if you're going to prosecute people, you're going to have those kind of details.
Yeah. It's I think it goes without saying that it's a tale of two cities here. It's like there are people who got educated and socialized with a mind that's open enough to have tolerance and respect for the dignity of other people that they might disagree with or see the world differently. You mentioned, didn't realize this was going to become like a, hey, by the way, in my life, but you mentioned one of your stories. So I'll mention one here.
Go for it.
Part of my family, there's like 15 or so brothers and sisters. It's like my uncle's wife that side of the family. And of those 15 brothers and sisters, and I don't remember the exact number, but there's like around 20%. So I don't know if it's 3 people or 2 people or 4 people, but of them who are non-binary, not non-binary, sorry, not heterosexual. So they just have whatever their open-minded and personal approach to sexuality is. They've always been really open with us about it, and just like, yeah, I do both, or I do neither, or whatever they do. But anyway, kindergarten. I think I was like somewhere around like really young. I was just like, oh, Uncle Dude, how did you know? And he's like, do you remember when you were in school? It doesn't matter what year you were, but do you remember when the teacher said something really nice to you and you got that special feeling? And I was like, I think I do. He's like, yeah, you get that special feeling, and that's how you know. You get it from one person and not another, and that person could be anybody. They could be anything, any in the spectrum of life, and it could be all. It could be poly, it could be, but everybody's different, and to embrace those differences. And it's the same thing with the physical. It's not just the mental, and it's not just how you identify as gender. It's physical. There's a full spectrum of people that go from both to neither, and just to see the world in as black and white and not acknowledge the gray is one thing. Which is, it's a character flaw, but it could be harmless. This is not harmless. This is taking it to the extremists and saying in our state, it's like they banned The Handmaid's Tale and some of these book bans. They're banning, yes. Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. So they're not just banning like state, what's the word? Like authoritarian control of sexuality and reproduction and Handmaid's Tale. They're banning like a coming of age book of how does a teenage woman experience their first woman experience get their first period. You're gonna ban that book because you're like, well, I don't know if kids can handle biology. Right. It's just the slippery slope here is damning, and I hope that the culture wars don't pervade the political discourse for too much longer, because it really is it's a distraction from all the important things that people actually have in common and the problems we need to solve together.
Well, but the problem is there is a very strong Christian fundamentalist feeling that dressing as the opposite gender is wrong because there's some reference to it in the Old Testament, and not very much, by the way, but a little bit. And so you've got a large fundamentalist religion in this country, but we're going to have to discuss that another time because we are out of time in this segment. This brings us to predictions. Dave, what do you have for us?
So this popped up on my radar recently. I thought it was pretty fascinating. Politico reported that President Biden's Office of Management and Budget Director, Shalanda Young, was recently on the receiving end of congressional vitriol while presenting the president's 2024 budget. Senator Romney, who's typically considered a temperate, moderate statesman, he challenged Director Young on the White House's use of language indicating that GOP Congress members have plans to cut Social Security. The director's response referenced the plan published by the Republican Study Committee that would balance the budget within 10 years. And last time I checked, this group was chaired by Republican Congress member Kevin Hern and comprised of 170 Congress members, although it's known to have loose and fluid affiliations. So here's a quote real quick here from this exchange. This is from Politico. Romney repeatedly asked Young to name a sitting lawmaker that had proposed cutting benefits. Young replied, current members have well-known policies out there to cut Social Security and Medicare. Romney shot back, that's wrong, and it's simply wrong, and it's not honest to say that to members of Congress. I find this offensive in the extreme. Young maintained President Biden, quote, believes the existential threat to Social Security are those who want to cut it. And Romney said back, the biggest threat is that in 10 years or so, the Social Security Trust Fund runs out of money and benefits get automatically cut by 25%. We do not want that to happen. So my prediction is that Congress is so caught up in this conversation, this debate, this discussion, that they will back into a solution that actually secures the solvency of Social Security by raising the amount of money that comes into it. Because if you're not going to cut it, You have to raise the amount of money that comes into it. Like there's not too many other ways around it. So that's my prediction. They're going to figure out how to actually extend the lifespan of the trust fund, sort of by accident.
All right, I'll be real quick. I previously predicted that Joe Biden will not be running. I'm less certain of that now because even though there isn't a lot of fundraising and we're not getting our emails for that, he did put together a team that is supposed to look into pulling the various Democratic Party constituencies together and trying to deal with our internal differences. But that doesn't necessarily mean he's planning to run. It means he wants it in his legacy to be able to hand it off to another Democrat. I'm sticking by my prediction. I am less certain of that now. His polls have gone up to about 44%. They've been creeped up. We'll see what happens, with economic news. But I'm less certain of it. But I do believe that he is going to announce by the end, one way or another, by the end of April, and we will know if I was right or wrong. All right, well, that wraps it up for this week. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.